On March 17, 1988, on a calm, warm morning at Camilo Daza Airport in Cucuta, an Avianca Boeing 727 was ready to take off on Flight 410, which would connect Cucuta with Cartagena, with stops in Barranquilla and Bucaramanga, completing a domestic route. The atmosphere remained serene. At first glance, there were no signs of complications. The day seemed to promise a smooth flight operation, but a series of decisions, human errors, and unforeseen circumstances would drastically change that perception within minutes. The aircraft chosen for this operation was a Boeing 727-100, a commercial plane powered by 3 engines mounted at the rear of the fuselage, valued for its reliable performance on medium-range routes and its capacity to accommodate more than 140 passengers. This particular unit had over 20 years of service and had logged more than 44,000 hours of operation. Built in 1966, despite its structural reliability, it was not originally intended to fly this route. The change happened hours earlier, when the technical team detected a fault in the originally scheduled plane. Unable to fix the problem quickly, they decided to replace the aircraft, which triggered a significant delay and completely disrupted the itinerary's timing. This forced modification sparked a chain of events that would end in tragedy. In command was Captain Francisco Ardila, an experienced 35-year-old pilot with nearly 10,000 hours of flight time, of which more than 4,000 were on the 727 model. Flying alongside him as first officer was Eduardo Murillo, a young man of only 23 years, just beginning his experience with large commercial jets. His record included less than 350 hours on this type of aircraft. Completing the technical team was flight engineer Manuel Santana, a veteran of Colombian Aviation with over 6,000 hours accumulated on various models. He was responsible for overseeing the functioning of systems, engines, and fuel. Additionally, in an informal gesture, a guest captain, a colleague from the same airline and a personal friend of Ardila, had requested to observe the takeoff from the cockpit. The captain agreed, allowing him to sit in the auxiliary seat located just behind the controls. On board were also 4 flight attendants and 136 passengers, making a total of 143 people starting this journey with different destinations, intentions, and hopes. While the crew carried out protocols to start up the new aircraft, Ardila appeared uneasy. The aircraft replacement had caused more than 2.5 hours of delay, a gap he wanted to somehow make up. At 1:07 p.m., the Boeing was ready to start taxiing toward the active runway. However, an unexpected order came from the control tower. They had to wait a few more minutes because another aircraft was about to perform a nearby maneuver. The captain's reaction was one of annoyance. He believed the incoming traffic did not pose an immediate conflict and decided to request a modification to the usual procedure. Instead of following the instrument departure protocol, which requires a specific pattern and strict separations, Ardila proposed climbing under visual flight rules, which would allow takeoff without waiting for the other aircraft to pass. With this decision, he intended to save valuable time, avoiding the standard pattern and gaining at least 10 minutes by heading directly through the visual corridor toward the west. Although the plan seemed workable given the visibility from the ground, it involved risks that not everyone in aviation is willing to accept. At 1:13 p.m., Flight 410 received final clearance. The plane moved to the threshold of runway 33, and with power released, began its takeoff roll. First Officer Murillo, responsible for controls at this stage, gently pulled the central lever, and the nose lifted off the ground. The aircraft left the runway with force, quickly gaining altitude. As it climbed, the landing gear retracted, and the flaps began returning to their neutral position. Captain Ardila, satisfied with the takeoff, made a brief radio communication and then resumed casual conversation with his colleague sitting in the rear seat. During these moments, the first officer firmly guided the plane, focused on maintaining the initial course. What seemed like a trouble-free day began to change subtly but fatally. The sky, clear from the surface, concealed a different reality just a few hundred meters above the ground. The area around Cucuta is surrounded by elevations, and the rising afternoon heat had started to generate low clouds forming as they collided with the hillsides. Thus, the warm, humid air from the valley began to condense, slowly covering the hills with a dense, persistent fog. The Boeing passed the first 1,000 feet of altitude and entered a cloud layer that quickly erased all visual reference points. Visibility from the cockpit almost completely disappeared. By then, the aircraft was moving away from the airport, heading north. From another plane approaching on the opposite runway, a pilot recognized Captain Ardila's voice and sent a friendly greeting, causing an additional distraction. The air traffic controller requested that this aircraft perform a holding maneuver to maintain distance from the departing flight. Meanwhile, First Officer Murillo, without clear instructions, began turning left to separate the aircraft, but drifted away from the authorized corridor and took a dangerous route south. The turn was slow but continuous, and no one in the cockpit noticed the deviation, with zero visibility and an increasingly critical situation. Ardila chatted casually with his guest colleague, leaving the co-pilot in command without supervision. Murillo, with little experience and limited training in low visibility conditions, followed the instruments without noticing the deviation toward an area not authorized for visual flight. In the dense fog and without active assistance, he was flying blind in a dangerous zone. Around 1:15 p.m., the plane had left the usual corridor and was approaching El Espartillo Hill, with its peak over 1,800 meters hidden behind the fog. Collision was imminent. At that moment, the guest pilot noticed something unusual about the maneuver, and his tone changed to alarm. He approached the controls and asked if they were heading to Bogota, pulling Ardila out of his distraction, who then focused on the controls. The engineer also noticed the problem and asked about the heading. Ardila understood the seriousness and ordered a quick turn to the right, warning of the fog's proximity. Murillo tried to correct, but there was no longer time or space to avoid the crash. The radar did not detect the terrain in time. The aircraft lacked the mandatory proximity warning systems of the era. Without visibility, with misinterpreted instruments, and without clear leadership, the Boeing 727 was heading straight toward the mountain. At 1:17 p.m., the plane crashed into the north slope of El Espartillo Hill at about 480 kilometers per hour. The impact was instantaneous and fatal. The fuselage disintegrated, and everyone on board died instantly. The roar was heard kilometers away. At first, locals thought it was a storm. Later, news arrived that a plane had disappeared from the radar shortly after taking off from Cucuta. Emergency teams were activated immediately, but the remote mountainous location made the search difficult. Access was only possible via rural roads or helicopters, which took hours due to the persistent fog. When rescuers finally reached the crash site, they found a devastating scene. Fuselage debris scattered among vegetation, personal belongings strewn among rocks and trees, and no sign of life among the charred fragments. Recovery efforts lasted several days, and identifying the victims was slow and painful for their families. The entire country was shocked by the magnitude of the tragedy. Avianca, the national airline, faced one of its worst disasters. Aviation authorities launched a thorough investigation to understand what went wrong and how a flight with less than 5 minutes in the air ended in a fatal accident. Analysis of the voice and data recorders revealed a chain of errors. The most serious was the lack of active leadership by the captain during the critical phase of the flight. Instead of focusing on the climb and supervising the co-pilot, he was distracted by casual conversation and allowed a third pilot without operational duties to be present. Murillo, the co-pilot, was young and lacked the experience to handle zero visibility conditions without direct guidance. Without corrections or support during takeoff, he made wrong decisions that diverted him from the safe course. Using visual climb procedures in a mountainous area with forming clouds was another key factor. Although permitted under certain conditions, the pilots should have followed the instrument procedure, designed to prevent accidents in dangerous terrain where visibility is limited. The final report was clear: the accident could have been avoided. There were no technical failures, sabotage, or extreme weather conditions. The cause was exclusively human.